Welcome back to the second session of the Annual Council Meeting, to our China session, as it was entitled by Vessela earlier. And I had been joking a bit that the first panel was already a lot about China, and everything is about China. And I've only been with ECFR for 2 years, but I feel 15 years older. So I think it is because everything is about China these days at the moment. I think we're at a crucial juncture in our relationship with China. The new German government is having to deal with this early on in its tenure. I think what Weyand said, that they have to allow reality to surprise them, is already in for surprises on day one, which is a good reason and a good moment for us to discuss this subject. China has changed its response to Europe. It is lashing out more forcefully. Sanctions, trade restrictions, bullying are now all part of the portfolio. The case of Lithuania just today being the most recent and prominent example. The tone is sometimes getting more shrill, and Europe has to find a response. China is at the same time becoming more inward-focused before the 20th Party Congress. Under the veil of pandemic restrictions, the Communist Party leadership is isolating China not only from international travel, but also from discussions, debates, and is making the business environment quite a bit more difficult for international players. This is of great concern, particularly to German companies that are present in the Chinese market. Across Europe, the question remains whether the multifaceted approach, the holy trinity of China being simultaneously a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival, is still an adequate guiding principle for an increasingly challenging relationship. The latest EU move speaks volumes in that regard, and as hinted to by Florian in the first session, much to the liking of my ECFR colleagues, particularly in Jonathan Hackenbroich and his team, we have now, with this kind of holy trinity has now been added another tool that is more into like nodding to the three musketeers, all for one, one for all, the anti-coercion tool that we've already talked about in the first session. It now joins the ranks of recent European measures, from enhanced investment screening to the new approach on foreign subsidies to secure European interest in a changing international economic and trade reality. So the question for my panel is Europe ready for this new normal? And I have the pleasure and honor to welcome with me on this fantastic panel, Linde, Foreign Minister of Sweden, joining us from Sweden, digitally, virtually, but is going to be here for all of your questions and for her input. Sabine Weyand, to the very right, Director General at DG Trade at the European Commission. And we were already joking about it. Our quota male representative from this panel is Wolfgang Niedermark, member of the Executive Board of the Federation of German Industries. We would have loved, of course, to have welcomed Minister Linde in Berlin, but we fully understand the current travel constraints, and we're very delighted that she's joining us virtually. Minister Linde, it would be great if you could start us off with the Swedish perspective on the future of the political and economic relationship with China. It's not been an easy ride for Sweden, bullying, sanctions, and yet the Swedish government cautions in reacting too forcefully. Mr. Linde, thank you for joining us. And what is your take? Where are we headed in Europe's relationship with China? What are current Swedish priorities when it comes to that? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for hosting the annual meeting and for inviting to speak today on an issue of great importance, our relation with China. It's an issue which we are devoting a lot of attention to in Stockholm, like in other capitals, and I'm happy to offer some views from the Swedish perspective. I will do so on the basis of 3 points. Firstly, relations with China require a broader outlook and more information sharing than relations with perhaps any other country. In 2019, the Swedish government presented a communication on China to Parliament. It remains the only strategy document of its kind in the Swedish government that has singled out just one country. In the communication, we stated that the rise of China is one of the greatest global changes since the fall of the Berlin Wall. This means that China's action affects so many more policy areas, so many more areas of society than 10 to 15 years ago. In the parliamentary year ending in September, the Swedish government received parliamentary questions on China every third day, directed to 11 out of 22 members of cabinet. In the past, public debate on China in Sweden was strongly focused on two areas: human rights and trade. Today, it also covers technology, culture, investments, climate issues, energy, and many more areas. Every country pursues its national interests. What makes China different from many other countries is that China has both a long-term view and resources large enough to be achieved in just about all areas of international cooperation. As such, there is a clear need to strengthen information sharing and knowledge of China on many levels. I think that the awareness of this need has grown considerably in the past few years in Sweden, but also in EU as a whole. Second, we must remain confident that we already have the foundation we need, the only foundation that will be viable in the long term, our firm commitment to rule-based international cooperation grounded in international law. In the international debate on China, it is sometimes implied that China somehow calls us to change our own policy to adapt or to be able to compete with China. Nothing could be more wrong. Our response to Chinese state subsidies or Chinese market restrictions against foreign companies should not be to adopt our own extensive subsidies, restrict access, or otherwise return to various kinds of economic state planning. It should be to continue to encourage China to remove its subsidies and improve market access. Our response to difficulties faced by foreign journalists in China can never be to treat Chinese journalists in Europe or elsewhere in the same way. Not only would such action violate our own commitments, they would lead to a never-ending downward spiral of action and retaliation. In Sweden and in EU, we have stated our policies clearly. In Sweden's case, we have the communication I mentioned, which clearly states the centrality of the EU in Sweden's relation with China. In the EU's case, we have the 2016 China strategy and the 2019 joint communication on China. These documents underline our commitment to rule-based international cooperation grounded in international law. This is also a commitment which we share with many like-minded partners like the USA, which we must maintain a close dialogue on issues relating to China. Thirdly, we should acknowledge that to some extent, the current blend of progress and setbacks in our interaction with China will likely remain in the foreseeable future. This is perfectly natural. In several important areas, the EU and China have different interests. We have already expressed what this means in practice, that China's rise means both opportunities and challenges. Or, as the 2019 EU Joint Communication states, that China is both a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival in governance issues, all at once. I think that once we acknowledge this and communicate it clearly, we can approach discussion on China calmly and confidently and avoid the high tempers of agitated feelings we have sometimes in public discussions on China. The fact that difficulties element exist between EU and China relation do not in any way lessen the need to pursue a dialogue and seek to work with China in areas like climate and the WTO reform. The opportunities remain. A global issue like climate, we should pursue a forward-looking dialogue on issues like development, finance, gender equality, and Agenda 2030. The EU and China must continue to hold regular summits. Ladies and gentlemen, China is the world's largest trading nation and the world's second largest economy. On its part, the EU is the world's largest trading community. The EU and its members are together the largest donor in the world of overseas development assistance. We are a leading multilateral actor in many areas. if we ensure solid information sharing across policy areas, if we trust in our commitment to rule-based international cooperation grounded in international law, and if we realize that a perhaps somewhat unusual blend of progress and setbacks is not going to disappear, we will have embarked on a steady path which will allow us to effectively pursue our interest in relation to China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Linde. Maybe allow me to briefly follow up. So information sharing, trust in ourselves, and kind of being ready for a tough ride, is that still good enough for what we are facing when we are looking at the speed with which China is kind of changing the international environment and the kind of gravity with which it is challenging the way we do international trade, with the way we behave in international organizations? Are we up to speed?
Well, of course, it's not the only thing, but as I reckon when we had one of our discussions in the Foreign Affairs Council on China, of which we have had quite a few now, is that sometimes we think that the reaction from China towards one country is specifically for this country, and then we see that they are actually changing their modus of operandi. As one example, we were sure that it was the Chinese ambassador who were yelling and screaming and threatening parliamentarians, threatening journalists, and that was a specifically personal trait of this particular ambassador. And then when we started to talk about it among ourselves, our foreign ministers, it seemed like that was a trait that was happening in several countries. And then, of course, you can react in different ways. And now we see different ways of handling the relations, and we really need to share that kind of information, both on how they are dealing with us, and also when we have the same kind of problem. And many of the countries have also very, very difficult consular cases that we try very hard to solve, but it has shown that there is not much constructive reaction from China when it comes to this.
Thank you very much. I would also be happy to invite all of you for questions from the audience very soon, but I would like to throw it first to our other panelists here sitting next to me. Sabine, Weyand, you have been involved in these conversations for a long time now at the Brussels end, and have advocated for the now sort of frozen comprehensive agreement on investment quite fiercely. You've also recently been quoted saying that we should re-engage China. And I was just trying to use this opportunity to say, how do you mean that? What do you mean when you say re-engagement?
Well, let me pick off where Minister Linde left off, and that is China is too big to ignore. And we share the same planet, whether we like it or not. So we have to find a way to get along. And that is why there's no alternative to engaging China, difficult as it is. Because what's the alternative? The alternative is isolating China. An isolated China is a much more dangerous China. So we are condemned to finding a way to get along. Has this become more difficult? Absolutely. I would still say the triptych of China as a negotiating partner, an economic competitor, a systemic rival is still relevant. 30% of global growth will happen in China in the next years. We cannot ignore the economic power of China, nor can we ignore to what extent our companies, our economies are intertwined. At the same time, we have to recognize that the direction that China has been taking in recent years is a challenge for everyone, including for the EU. Let me start with the economic field. We see this dual circulation strategy, which is China's version of decoupling. Actually, they started that before the US started with decoupling. So we see these tendencies. We see a reinforcement of state control over the economy. a curtailing of personal freedoms and also the freedoms of businesses. So these are all challenges. Minister Linde referred to the wolf warrior diplomacy, which we see on the rise as well. And it is very clear that the expectations we all had when China joined the WTO 20 years ago have not materialized, because there we expected that China would go down the road of a market-oriented reform. Well, that is no longer on the cards, and we have to be lucid about this. And then we have to say, so what do we do? So, and I think here I would like to pick up, I mean, we are very much wedded to a rules-based system, but we also have to recognize that that rules-based system is not just challenged by the rise of China, but it is also challenged by the fact that the US has walked away from the institutions it has created after World War II. So now we are condemned to navigating a world which is power-based rather than rules-based. There's no way around that fact. So what do we need? Then we have to, of course, see also politically China throwing its weight around in the South China Sea, the whole issue of Hong Kong, Taiwan, and I haven't even mentioned the Uyghurs and Xinjiang. So the challenges are abandoned. So what we need to do is, economically, I think we need to find a way to organize the coexistence of different systems, because we will not be able to change China's system. So we have to find a way to organize a peaceful coexistence. That is difficult enough, but that is what we will have to do in that respect. We also have to, so we need to engage China in reforming the WTO. We will not be able to reform the WTO without China. We are also not able to do it without the United States.
At all is a good question, I guess.
We will also not be able to tackle climate change without China. So we have to work with them multilaterally. We have to engage them bilaterally because, I read, for instance, the coalition agreement of the new German government, which very rightly puts the emphasis on reciprocity. But in order to organize reciprocity, you need to engage. The agreement on investment, which is frozen at the moment for good reasons, because of the sanctions that the Chinese leadership has imposed on the very people who are supposed to ratify that agreement. So that was a little bit self-defeating, I would argue, but that's where we are. But that agreement would have gone quite some way in terms of creating reciprocity. Not all the way, but quite a long way. So I think, there's no perspective at the moment to get it ratified in the EU, but I would argue that we would be better off if we had it in place. So I would not want to abandon that. There are also very interesting things which are exactly about the role of the state in the economy, about the distorting industrial subsidies that the minister was talking about. On all these things, there are rules that China has never accepted in any negotiation with anyone else. So we need to build on that. We need to preserve, because it shows that this is what China is able to commit to. We are now working in the trilateral with the US, with Japan, to see, can we craft new rules on these issues, which we can then plurilaterally, multilaterally bring to the WTO, bring China on board saying, you've benefited enormously from the WTO. If you want to continue benefiting from an open trading system, there's a down payment to be made to curtail the effects of your system on the rest of the world. And then we have to do this engagement on the basis of our internal strength and assertiveness. And that is where we need to strengthen our own internal rulebook. And we've been doing that over the last few years. And there are different ways we need to look at that. There is the security angle, where we have to make sure that our strategic assets do not get taken over by investors of which we know nothing and where we may have problems further down the road. So we have the foreign direct investment screening, we have strengthened export control. In the area of reciprocity, we now hopefully finally will get the international procurement instrument to rebalance the situation. Then there's the whole issue of human rights. We have the global human rights sanctions regime, which was applied and led to reactions by China. We will come with due diligence legislation, which will also make sure that companies that invest in China, but also around the world, respect basic human rights in their supply chains, and we will make sure that products derived from forced labor will not find their way onto the European market. So there's a lot we are doing. We have proposed a new instrument on foreign subsidies control in the internal market. There's a lot to be done. I think if we look at the toolbox, it's getting nicely filled, and it is surgical weapons and not just a big hammer. And I haven't mentioned the anti-coercion instrument that we put forward yesterday, because I'm sure that we will come to that in the discussion. Where we have a problem, last remark, is in the way we cooperate between the EU level and the member states. Because what we have seen is that when China introduced sanctions, what happened is that contacts at EU level were frozen. Oh, no, we cannot engage. So we stop the high-level economic dialogue, we don't continue the political dialogue, etc. But the member states individually, and especially the big ones, were quite happy to continue their economic engagement with China. And that is what weakens us. So we need to find a way to have much more discipline in terms of how we engage. It is, yes, we need to share the analysis, we need to share our intelligence about what's happening in China, but we also need to have the discipline that we engage with China on the basis of a common European position. Thank you.
Thank you. Because I know that Minister Linde has to leave us a little bit earlier as well, and we don't want to steal her time for too long, I know that we have, and I cannot see him, but there he is, Jonathan Hackenbroich, my colleague in the audience, who would like to pose a question as well, or a little comment as well. I'd like to call on him right now before I hand the floor to you, Wolfgang, and then give Minister Linde the opportunity to say a few closing remarks before she has to leave us as well.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for this very interesting panel and your contributions. I work on geoeconomics at the ECFR, and I have a question on, concretely, you've mentioned it, Ms. Weyand, economic coercion and the anti-coercion instrument. If we look at the trajectory, maybe start in 2019 or before 2020, economic coercion was coming from China, was very much something that the region knew. Maybe not as much Europe. 2020, you start off with counter sanctions against the European sanctions. And before we knew some of the threats, of course, with the Chinese ambassador in Berlin thinking about car tariffs over the Huawei question and 5G. We knew about, there was a threat to cut off the Netherlands from medical supplies at the height of the pandemic, so forth. But then actual implementation 2020, counter sanctions, and also not just against persons, but economic sanctions as well, with H&M, Adidas falling off e-commerce platforms, boycotts, and so forth. We saw what happened to Australia. That was sort of 2020, and then in 2021, we're now sorry, that was 2021, and we're now in a situation where what seems to be happening just today is extraterritorial sanctions from the Chinese. If the reports are right that China is pressuring non-Lithuanian, non-Chinese companies to stop dealing with Lithuanians. So I wonder, what do you make of that trajectory? Where are we headed? And of course, what do we do about Lithuania? How do we show solidarity with Lithuania? And is the anti-coercion instrument the answer?
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I would like to put this to Minister Linde as the first respondent here, because I think Sweden has good experiences or bad experiences in that regard as well, being singled out by the Chinese side. So please, do you have any comments on that? What do we do about Lithuania?
Well, unfortunately, we see that the Chinese response is very aggressive when it comes to issues of, for example, the human rights situation. And now Sabine mentioned a little bit about Xinjiang and so on, but we have also made from the Swedish side an officially published report on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law in China. And it confirms, of course, that the civil and political rights situation is very serious. We try to take up the issue every time we meet, and the response is unfortunately not very constructive. So I think it's very important here also that we act together in the EU. And since we published this report, we have seen an increasing number of reports about, for example, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, what's going on in now the threats to Taiwan, and also the try to answer it. And you mentioned here several times the Commission's new proposal for an anti-coercion instrument. And of course, this is brand new. We have to study it very much. But on a general level, we appreciate very much the Commission's efforts to conduct a consultation within the EU in order to analyze the problem of this economic coercion. And there is a need for, I wouldn't use the word discipline. I don't like that EU Commission should tell the member state to be disciplined. It's a little bit too patriarchalic for me. But I would say that I totally agree that we should act in coherence and that we should share information, act in accordance with common agreed principle, and always guided by the principle of openness, international cooperation, international law. Thank you very much. And as you say, unfortunately, and I said it before, since we have a new government, we have some new things that we absolutely need to do. So unfortunately, I have to leave you here and wish you all the best with the rest of the annual meeting. Thank you very much.
Very much, Minister Linde, and thank you very much for joining us and taking the precious time out of your very, very busy schedule. And with this, I would like to turn the floor now to Wolfgang Niedermark, who's been very patiently waiting here in the middle, but is kind of due to the logistics of our conference, we have to sometimes juggle things around a little bit. Wolfgang, the German industry is benefiting most from China business, one can say. But one could also say it's Europe's Achilles heel, in a way, in terms of strategic dependencies vis-à-vis China. You've worked in the business sector before, you've not been with the Federation all your life, and you were actually also quite enthusiastic about China business for a long time. But you had your last post in Hong Kong, and that was also quite the experience, I would say, in the last few years. What is it that you take home with, and how does this influence kind of your thinking about where are we headed? Are we ready for this new reality when it comes to China? Are we there where we need to be intellectually, in terms of the tools, in terms of the measures?
Yeah, perhaps I would say we are getting ready, yes. We are not that far away, what might be the impression in some public discussion. We know each other very well. BDI and other business associations are attending meetings like that. There is a constant exchange of views with not only politics, with the Commission, with the academia, think tanks, so we have understood. Then our job as a business association is to bring this perception and the awareness what's going on into our community, and I think we are really doing this job. And perhaps you remember our papers we have been publishing constantly, starting with this China paper in 2019, where we also refer to China as a systemic rival. I think we are doing our job, and we are ready to take part and to play our role. You might be confronted with some business representatives here and there who still think the business of business is business and shy away from any political standpoint. I think these are the minority, and we are working on that. People know what's going on, and people are on the scene. And there's also a changing attitude. Of course, you mentioned that I've been working for a multinational corporation. I was proud to hand contracts on new investment in Chongqing to our board members, Mrs. Merkel and Li Keqiang, standing next to us. And of course, we were proud to achieve more business, more investment in China. What Mrs. Weyand said, of course 30% of our markets, the growth comes from China. We want to be part of it. We would like to stay in business. But now we have to acknowledge that there is a new era. I'm quoting the paramount leader every time. It's a new era. We have to recognize it, and we have to adopt. And the new era is different, and we have to be clear that it's not acceptable in many ways how China is behaving. Our patience is in a way also at an end, that China is asking for special treatment in WTO and on all kind of multilateral rule-based regulation. And I say, well, you are not a developing country anymore. You should also stick into these systems and you play by the rules. And I'm a little bit of a different opinion than Mrs. Linde. Of course, we would like to defend our openness and the market-driven, rule-based system here. But since China is not accepting it, we have to go for reciprocity. Very clear. And we, as a business association, we have had all these demands, and I see progress. So your question is, are we ready? We are getting ready. There's a long list of achievements already with investment screening, with anti-subsidy, now anti-coercion. We are part of this game. We, together with Jonathan and ECFR, of course we were involved in the discussion on anti-coercion, and we think we have to do that. And then one final point. I'm very grateful that you mentioned coexistence. That is also our concept. Seeing all these problems, we should never forget that, of course, we want to do business and solve problems together with China. Pandemic is one example, climate change, but overall trade, of course. Also, our wealth and our democracy is based on economic success. Without economic success, we have a democratic problem here as well. It's not only the Communist Party who seeks legitimation from economic success. Same is true here. I don't want to see unemployment rates of 10% here because of a breaking system of our international cooperation with China and other autocrats, and then have to explain to our population what's going on and that we are not that successful anymore, then we are under pressure. So we need coexistence. We don't strive for regime change, but we have, of course, responsibility. So coexistence is an offer to China, to Russia, to others, but it goes hand in hand with responsibility. And I know that our companies know what their responsibility is. Some companies are more advanced, some are lagging behind, but all in all, we are on the same track to fulfill the requirements to our responsibility. And the drivers are very clear. I think the next generation, my sons are mid-20, they don't want to work for companies who have not understood yet what their responsibility is. I'm quite confident that we are on the right track and getting ready. Yeah.
We're getting ready. I want questions from the audience now to come in, so you are better ready as well. Since I don't see any hands as of yet, I would have one follow-up question, maybe a quicker response from Sabine Weyand. You've said that we're taking you on right now. Just one quick question. What is the substantial change that you hope to achieve from the Chinese side? Because I think that is the question that is in our minds a lot when we are analyzing what is going on at the moment. There is a form of kind of political cost to be paid to anything that we're kind of advancing forward. What is the substantial change we're trying to achieve? And then maybe Carl Bildt, you want to ask a question as well, but I think you have to come to this microphone up here because otherwise the people on our live stream cannot hear you, whereas we in the room would be perfectly fine, I guess.
Okay, good panel. I agree with almost everything that's been said. Only remark, I think we must not only play defensively with China, we must be offensive. Because the name of the game with China is geoeconomics, and it's played out all over the place. So my question to Sabine primarily is, why don't we apply for membership of the CPTPP? Because economic primacy in Asia, that's where the game is. And that's where the EU should be as well, in my opinion.
Thank you, Carl. And I have another question coming in from my colleague, Jana Pulirin, head of the ECFR Berlin office.
Yeah, my question is on the transatlantic dimension of all of this. So we haven't talked much about this, but can we cooperate with the United States, with the Biden administration? And if so, where and how?
Are there additional questions? Otherwise, I would. Oh, please come to the microphone.
Thank you. There are calls in Washington that it is possible to trade off with Russia to deter China. Can it be the same option for the European countries, or they are much more cautious about Russia and not going to accommodate for the extent to deter China more?
Yeah, we've heard those voices coming from France at a certain point as well. Any further questions from the audience? If not, I would kick it back to our panelists. Sabine, Weyand, a number of questions for you.
I'll be telegraphic in answering them. I was very pleased to hear the call for being offensive, rather than because you don't win by just playing defense. But for me, that means that we have to strengthen the competitiveness and the resilience of our single market, because the way we engage economically with the rest of the world is on the basis of the strength of the internal market. And there we still have work to do, because the tendencies to become inward-looking are not limited to China or the United States. We also see these tendencies in the EU, and we have to fight against them. But I was less pleased when I heard your call for offensiveness being translated into a call for the EU to join the CPTPP. For me, that would be a very defensive move, because why would we join an agreement which has a much lower level of ambition than the bilateral FTAs we currently have in the region, that has a standard of data protection which is not compatible with our data privacy laws. From that point of view, I would see that as basically adopting a US model of regulation of trade, which I see absolutely no possibility to get through our authorizing environment, whether it's the member states or the European Parliament. Because also the sustainability standards are not up to the standards we are trying to project. We are, however, following what the CPTPP is doing, and I think there are areas where we can engage with them without necessarily joining the CPTPP. But our Indo-Pacific strategy is exactly trying to make sure that we are sufficiently present, and there are things we can do by linking up, for instance, our network of bilateral FTAs through common rules of origin. Let's not forget, actually, it's the rules of origin which is the innovative element of the CPTPP. So I think we can engage with that without, however, joining. With the United States, there are areas where we can work together, where our interests converge. For instance, in organizing the coexistence between market economies and non-market economies, we need the United States. And that is why, for instance, we are working with them on these issues. We are also working with Japan and others in order to see what are the rules that we can create that would allow for this sort of coexistence. But we do not have identical interests to the United States.
Where do they diverge?
Well, I mean, the importance of the Chinese economy is much bigger for the EU than it is for the US. As in general, trade is much more important for all EU member states than it is for the United States. The United States is a much more inward-looking economy, so the interests are not exactly the same.
Because we're more vulnerable in the end.
Sorry?
Because we're more vulnerable and more dependent.
Oh, no, thank you very much for raising that, because that's another point I disagree with. Because actually we looked into vulnerabilities, because the issue indeed came up, especially in the pandemic, the vulnerability of supply chains, etc. Questions of strategic dependence. And then we said, okay, well, let's look at the evidence for all this. So we started looking at the evidence. So we looked at all our imports, and we looked at where do we really have only one or two sources of supply. And that applied to 0.6% of our imports. And actually, our openness, our network of trade agreements is the answer to that, because then you diversify your supplies. So we are looking at strategic vulnerabilities, but actually, China is actually a lot more vulnerable, and there are strategic dependencies in other directions. We've done the analysis also of where is China strategically dependent on us, and we are there in a much better position than, for instance, the United States. There are also areas where China is dependent on the United States, but they are more dependent on the EU. So I think we have every reason to be assertive in our relationship. To deal with Russia in order to deter China, look, I'm not an expert on foreign policy, but it's currently Russia which is threatening the territorial integrity and moving borders on its own on the European continent. So I'm not sure that there is a willingness to pay any price for that. I think at the moment we are all very concerned about what's happening at the Ukrainian border. We are very worried about what's happening in Belarus. So I think we have to be able to deal with the challenges both raised by China and by Russia, different as they are.
I think Sabine Weyand pointed out really well the strengths that the European Union has. Do you think, Wolfgang, we're bringing them to the table at the fullest, as we should, and getting something out of it for our businesses? Because if we listen to business representatives in China, things are not looking so great. They're actually not, some of them are still making good money, but a lot of them are kind of squeezed out of the market. So if we have all of that potential, if we could use all of that, why are we not using it?
Quoting those guys who are in charge for a very particular field of business in China, with some of those partners alone, is not telling the truth, really. That's our job here in Germany and Europe to generalize it a little bit. And by the way, not only for China, you are perfectly right. It's the same with Russia. That's why we have our responsible coexistence paper is not an anti-China or China-directed paper. It's of course talking about Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, Cuba, Myanmar, you name it. The list is really long. And so we have to generalize it. And here and there you have some individual views who might seem that they are contrary to what we are generally saying, but you have to understand that there is a certain background for it. This interdependence we clearly see, and we think we should be bold on that and make use of it and not shy away. I love this wording of Karin Göring-Eckardt. There's not really a good word for it in English, it's cowardice perhaps, but she said it must have an end with Hasenfüßigkeit.
Yeah, Hasenfüßigkeit is very good German.
Hasenfüßigkeit, I love this term, and that's exactly what we had before. And we need to be bolder, to be self-confident what our economic strengths are, where we are important also for technology development in China and elsewhere, and we make use of it. And we are on this track. And perhaps not everyone yet, as I would admit, but on general we have a clear progress of recognition here. With perhaps one word on the transatlantic cooperation. We as BDI, together with other business associations, have immediately started a new transatlantic business initiative once Biden was in administration. And not in order to follow again American leadership, but to have our own position, come up with these positions on a European level, to bring in these positions into a European process and then discuss with our American friends. When we started this, the Americans immediately said, oh, okay, that's great, let's cooperate against China. And we said, no, let's first define our positions here, let's see who is playing which role, and then we tackle all these problems in alignment, of course, among like-minded countries, but not as your little brother, but with a clear, own, self-confident European position. And that's what we are doing, and by the way, we are quite happy with the progress. Also there, companies are supporting us, recognizing how important it is.
Because they also understand their own kind of dependencies. Mark Leonard has a question as well, and I would invite everyone else as well to join us in asking the panel.
Thanks, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I just wondered if, Sabine, if you'd be willing to give us a bit more detail on the study that you did. What are the areas of strategic dependency which China has on Europe and vice versa?
That would be fantastic, and I would also like to circle it back a little bit to the Lithuania question, because it's a very real and live policy problem that we're now facing. Foreign ministers will have to discuss it. Annalena Baerbock on her first day is being asked about it, and not only asked about that, also being asked about boycotting the Olympics, and all of that will have like a significant impact on our relationship with China. So if we bring it back to the Lithuania question as well, what are we going to do about this now that we are in this situation that we cannot wish away anymore, that we have China very actively targeting European companies. What does the BDI do when it's a German company that is then coming to the BDI and saying, hang on, what are we supposed to do about this now? We're being pressured from all sides. This is not good. What is your advice for them? Maybe we'll start with Wolfgang this time and then go to Sabine.
No, I would be interested if you give us some advice.
Well, first of all, and I think Minister Linde referred to that, this is neither the first nor the last time that we have that sort of pressure. So let's not pretend that what has happened this week is something that has never been seen before and that we've never been dealt with, that has never been dealt with before. There are multiple instances where these things get sorted out, ideally not through the media. Because if you are in a problem-solving mode, there may be other ways to do that than do that through the media. So what we have seen, though, and that's why I would like to come back to the question on the anti-coercion instrument. The anti-coercion instrument is a reflection of the fact that we live in an environment which is power-based instead of rules-based. So, and that is not just an issue in our relationship with China. To be quite frank, when we started our reflections on the design of this instrument, it was not triggered by Chinese behavior. We, at the time, had the Trump administration. We had the threat of retaliatory tariffs on the digital services tax. We had the threat of car tariffs. We had all sorts of things where we said, well, we cannot be condemned to going to the WTO and wait for 18 months until we have a first panel ruling. So let's see what we can do in order to deal with this sort of interference in our policy space. Then, of course, I mean, things happened. But I want to make the general point, this is not an instrument that is directed against any country. This is an instrument that helps us navigate an environment where rules are less reliable and less available to solve disputes. So while we are trying to fix the rules, we also need to equip ourselves how to deal with their absence. But again, if you look at the instruments, and that's why I made the remark, it is not a hammer, as some have been saying. The idea is to say, wait a moment, we are aware what's happening, we are calling out your behavior, but the idea is then to have a cooling off period, to talk to the country, to give them a chance to walk away from the coercive behavior. If that doesn't work, then, we have the possibility to act. And that is something we will apply whenever a case of coercive behavior is brought to our attention. So if we had the instrument, no doubt Lithuania would have brought it to our attention. We would have looked at it in that context. Well, the proposal came out yesterday, and I think we will have to deal with the current problem the way we've been dealing with similar problems in the past, i.e. without the instrument yet. I do hope, however, that it will encourage the European Parliament and the Member States to agree to this instrument fairly rapidly. On the study on strategic dependencies, I don't have it with me and I don't want to mislead you, but it is available, publicly available on our website as part of the industrial policy strategy that we put out. So that is what we are working on. But to give you just some illustrations, there are obviously some dependencies on our side on active pharmaceutical ingredients where we need to look for alternatives. We are also looking for alternatives in the availability of materials that we need for our green transition, etc. And there are certain technologies, advanced manufacturing equipment, etc., where China is dependent on European inputs. So all this, of course, is also not static, so you need to look at it, but what you see is a much more nuanced picture and one which is much less concerning than sometimes you might think when you read headlines about vulnerabilities or strategic dependencies. We have to put this into perspective and look at the evidence, because otherwise we will go off on a wrong policy track.
It would also be a good kind of basis for being bold in foreign policy questions when it comes to our values and our interest base in that regard. Wolfgang.
But you understand why I was asking for Sabine to explain, because of course we would like to ride on these arguments. We fully accept this. It's a clear approach you are presenting here, and of course we need this toolkit. And we are very much in favor that the European Union is creating or improving its abilities in this respect. And then we could comment in the same way without quoting individual companies and individual cases, which is always very difficult for us. Our approach is always to deal with these issues in a general way. We never quote any particular company name when we deal with the Xinjiang topic. The same story. We have the general guidelines. We are happy that we are in line with the European Commission and more with our own government, obviously, or hopefully. And that's the way how we play our role in this. And then it's a responsibility again of the individual company to react in an appropriate way, depending on the size of business, the actual case, what's really going on, their exposure. It's really a complicated balancing act, and it's in the responsibility of each and every company to find its own way, by the way, according to their own code of conduct. I always remind our companies to their own standards they have been formulating. If you read those texts, some things are really clear, what you can do and what you cannot do.
They should not have to be forced, you mean, by that regard.
Yeah.
They should know themselves. We are ending, we're close to the end of our panel, but we have one question left here, and I would like to bring that in.
So it's very interesting that the European Commission promised a geopolitical commission, and it's happening. But it's happening on the economic part of the European Commission. So what would you like to see on the foreign policy side to strengthen this geopolitical dimension? And number two, on the economic side, a big part of being geopolitical is advancing the trade agenda. And we have a number of, it's good to dream of CPTPP, but I would dream before that to maybe get done with things like Chile, Mexico, Mercosur. So what do you need there in order to get that positive agenda moving?
Thank you very much. Now we have one more question here. It's always the same. Towards the end of the panel, the people come up with the question.
Just in following up, also on the study on dependencies, I was very surprised when I read the study on some issues, but now it's about to act even on the small dependencies we have, from the chips production to rare earths and other issues we need for the green development and transition. So my question would be, do we do enough as European Union and European countries to overcome these limitations we have, for example, on rare earth, in order to not to impede our Green Deal revolution or transformation?
So the foreign policy side, overcoming strategic dependencies, and I would throw one little one into the mix because it's almost Christmas. If you were to make one wish to the new German government of what they should do on this front, that they haven't been doing for the past 16 years and that you've been waiting for so long, what would that one wish be? And maybe this time around we do actually start with Wolfgang. I'll force you now.
Perhaps just this last question. What is our wish? Be pragmatic. Don't be radical. You need to find a balance with the new government between defending your principles on the one hand, and of course you have to do that, and be pragmatic and still be in business. So don't destroy everything by defending the principles. So there is a need for compromise. And you see that there might be a balancing act between Chancellor's office and Foreign Office and Economic Ministry. Let's see how it works. It's a difficult balancing act, and I hope that people are good enough to find the best position in this difficult terrain.
So do away with the Hasenfüßigkeit and find the Fingerspitzengefühl.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I think that's a good way
is
of
also a very nice term. Yeah.
Sabine, Weyand, please.
Yeah, well, there's a reason why I work on the trade side of the Commission, because that is where we do have the possibilities to act much more than on the foreign policy side. Now, there are lots of ideas on how to strengthen that, and that needs to happen. But for the time being, I think it is a reality check to say that the way the EU can engage with the rest of the world, also from a geopolitical perspective, is through economic and trade instruments. It goes beyond trade policy as such. So take, for instance, Global Gateway. which is our response to the Belt and Roads Initiative. We need to offer an alternative to countries. We need to invest in infrastructure, offer an alternative to countries then getting indebted to China, which provides loans without the necessary sustainability criteria, whether they are, financial sustainability or environmental sustainability. So I think it is high time that we develop instruments like that. I think we are gradually getting better at pooling what the EU institutions do and what member states do, but there is a big margin of progression. But it's work in progress. But I do think that the trade policy side is essential for a geopolitical and geoeconomic, not just commission, but a union which has Weltpolitikfähigkeit, as a former Commission President called it. And as we are into German here on this English-speaking panel, I wanted to throw that one in as well. And that brings me exactly to the point. We have a problem because, on the one hand, we want to shape the world in line with our interests and values, but at the same time, we are so caught up in our domestic debates that we have difficulties getting out of the starting blocks. So we are trying, and that is the downside of having all our instruments focused on the economic and trade side, because then we are trying to do too much with them. And let's compare how the US interacts with China compared to how the EU does it, because I think that is instructive. The US has no difficulties, the Biden administration has no difficulties in enforcing the Phase 1 deal negotiated by Trump vis-à-vis China. So, by the way, a deal which has negative consequences for the EU. So they go ahead with that. That does not, prevent them from standing up on issues of human rights, forced labor, the Uyghurs, etc. What does the EU do? The EU tries to use an investment agreement to solve all problems, from ILO ratification to human rights, forced labor, the situation of the Uyghurs, all through one instrument. Well, and then we see that the instrument risks, going under the weight of these expectations. And I think we have to clarify, we have to have more tools to reach all our objectives. So I'm not saying that we should sacrifice our values or human rights standards or whatever to our economic interest. Absolutely not. But we then need to have dedicated instruments, and of course we then have to apply them and also accept the consequences. But, we do have the global human rights sanctions regime, and we've been able to apply it despite the fact that it is subject to unanimity. So let's move forward on that, but let's not use one instrument to carry the whole weight of our global ambitions. And that would also be, it's not for me from the Commission to comment on the government or whatever. What I found encouraging in the coalition agreement is what I see is a much clearer European perspective. That it's a national policy, whether it's the economic policy or the foreign policy, which seems to be very clearly inscribed in a European perspective. And I think a reflection about what do we do with our trade agreements with Chile, with Mercosur, with Mexico, but also with the agreement with Canada. For Christ's sake, if a country like Germany cannot ratify an agreement with a partner like Canada, who are we kidding when we say that we want to shape the world in line with our interests and values? So, that is what we need to work on. By the way, the question of rare earths, access to raw materials, we have negotiated an agreement with Chile which would ensure non-discriminatory access to 60% of the world lithium resources. Well, let's try and get that out of the starting blocks. By the way, mining activities are also subject to sustainability impact assessment, so there's also a green dimension to the mining activities. So, let's be able to get this out of the starting blocks. We have a lot to do on our side there.
Wolfgang, you had something you wanted to add.
Listening to Sabine again, I also would like to reconfirm that the biggest hope we have is that everything the new German government is doing is embedded in European strategies. There should be no German solos at all in this respect, and that's also given seen that the German industry has, of course, a special position when it comes to Russia and China. But we need to be clear that everything we do is European-based and not Germany-based. That is also clearly our perspective, although I come from the Federation of German Industry. But we are a member of European industries, and that is our framework.
And this is the annual council meeting of the European Council for Foreign Relations, so I think this message resonates well with the audience here. I thank this panel very much, which was not lacking bluntness and clear thoughts and ideas, and I hope that we can carry on some of these discussions over the next year. I think you deserve a big hand from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janka, for this fantastic panel. Thank you to our participants. We will have 45 minutes break. It's a longer break so that you can discuss and absorb this very rich discussion. We will start with the breakouts. The Africa breakout session will take place in this room. The other two will be in the smaller rooms here to the left. And for those of you who are joining us for dinner, there will be transportation here at 20 to 7 in front of this building. If you like, you can also go directly to the Italian embassy, but very much looking forward to seeing you there at 7 p.m. Thank you.
We have entered a new phase of globalization, where leveraging economic power is now the #1 foreign policy tool. Countries do this by building strong trade and connectivity ties and by weaponizing these ties. At ECFR, we have expanded our work on geoeconomics and have built over the last 2 years our task force for strengthening Europe against economic coercion. Based on this work, we recommend that the EU build an EU resilience office to improve its strategic analysis, and an economic deterrent to take trade countermeasures when third countries try to coerce or blackmail Europeans. The European Commission has just proposed such an anti-coercion instrument, and it looks like some of our ideas have made it in. Ultimately, Europe needs a comprehensive strategy for the new geoeconomics age. A really ambitious trade and connectivity agenda, and finely attuned defenses. This will remain an important topic, not just for this panel, but for ECFR and the EU in the future.